Good evening, everyone. My name is Joe Lopez. I'm Vice President of Marketing and Communications for the Richard Nixon Foundation. And I want to start by thanking all members and supporters of the Richard Nixon Foundation who are with us tonight. Thank you for your support. We cannot do events like this without you, so thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Nixon Library tonight to hear from one of America's preeminent historians, Mr. Douglas Brinkley. You're in for a treat tonight. CNN called Mr. Brinkley a man who knows more about the presidency than any human being alive. It's quite a statement. He's the author of numerous best-selling and award-winning books, including 2 volumes on the Nixon White House tapes with fellow historian Luke Nichter. And tonight he joins us to discuss his new bestseller, Silent Spring Revolution, John F. Kennedy, Rachel Carson, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and the Great Environmental Awakening. This book is essential history for understanding this important era of presidential leadership. It's all more important as we're in the middle of the 50th anniversary of the Nixon presidency and the impactful environmental legacy that the 37th president left behind. As you'll learn from Mr. Brinkley's book, the environment became a major issue in the Nixon presidency just days into Richard Nixon taking office. The results of the Nixon administration include a far-reaching and forward-looking record of environmental conservation. Copies of Silent Spring Revolution are available for purchase tonight, and you could pick one up back here, and then Mr. Brinkley is happy to say hello and sign copies for you after his talk. So join me in welcoming Douglas Brinkley.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here, and thank you all for taking the time with the monsoon that's sweeping California. And here you are coming to hear me speak. Thank you, guys. I wanted to begin by just saying, when I was a kid, my friend, your dad, Tanner, Dave Wilson, his son is here, and his father played football at Perrysburg, Ohio. He was a great football legend, and Dave died not long ago, but his son and I have been able to stay in touch. And when I lived in Perrysburg as a boy in Ohio, my mother and father would take me on a trailer all over the United States to visit national parks. Because they came from a teaching background, we had time off in the summer, so we would go to the Great Smokies, or we would go to Big Bend, or the Grand Canyon, or Yellowstone, and the indelible memories seared on my imagination forever. Today they call it passports for the parks, where you can have it and check mark that you visited and all that. But we were essentially doing that, and wherever I went, I would pick up a brochure. Before our iPhones, it was brochures everywhere, just picking them up. And at any national park or monument, wildlife refuge we visited, somehow Theodore Roosevelt had something to do with it, or Franklin D. Roosevelt, but particularly TR. And so some years ago, and I have 3 kids of my own. One is a freshman at Pepperdine, and I'm hoping, thank you, and I'm hoping my son is looking to go to USC coming up, so I'll be out here a lot. But Theodore Roosevelt had asthma as a boy, and I had asthma. And so I just identified a lot with him. And when I had my own kids, I thought, wow, I figured out a clever thing. I can visit the national parks, do research, and write a book. And I did on TR and conservation. It was called The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt, and the Crusade for America. And it's about how TR as president, born in 1858. In 1859, Charles Darwin wrote The Origins of Species. Theodore Roosevelt's father ended up being the donor and founder of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. TR, as a young boy, declared, essentially, I want to be a wildlife naturalist. He went to Harvard and wrote his first book called The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. And off he went. And Theodore Roosevelt ended up writing like 37 books, 150,000 letters. And he really invented modern conservation in the United States. And when he was president from 1901 to 1909, Theodore Roosevelt saved about 234 million acres of wild America as parklands. How do you do that? If it's a national park, you go through Congress. If it's a national monument like the Grand Canyon, you have to use executive power. And TR saved the Grand Canyon because Senate didn't want it with executive power. He said, do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone. And he created the U.S. Forest Service, which runs all of our national forest lands, and Department of Agriculture. He really gave birth to today's U.S. Fish and Wildlife. He created the first 51 federal bird reservations. A couple were the size of West Virginia. And so I wrote that book, and I realized at that point it was the first wave of what today we call environmentalism. First wave, Theodore Roosevelt's. The second wave was FDR's generation, because as much as we talk about the stock market collapsing in 1929, we're also dealing with just an agricultural disaster with the Dust Bowl. Wetlands had been drained, reckless clear cutting. We didn't do scientific forestry or scientific farming. There was a need to upgrade agriculture, and FDR seized it. The thing to always remember about Franklin Roosevelt is he was not a New York City politician. He was upstate New York. His constituents were dirt farmers, orchard growers, Hudson River fisher folk, Catskill Mountain people. And he got, when he was governor, he had a successful program of paying unemployed people $1 a day to restock ponds, to create picnic sites, and particularly to tree plant. And as president from 1933 to 1945, the Civilian Conservation Corps and other work relief projects planted nearly 3 billion trees. And FDR helped create 800 state parks. And so that's the second wave, and I wrote about that in a book called Rightful Heritage. The book I'm here to talk about, Silent Spring Revolution, is the third wave of environmentalism. And the stars weren't one Roosevelt. It was a combination of people, hence the word revolution. And Richard Nixon and John Ehrlichman and Russell Train and William Ruckelshaus, people synonymous with Nixon Library, were part of that. How did Nixon become part of it? You all know Nixon loved Theodore Roosevelt. When he left the White House, he's quoting Theodore Roosevelt. The man in the arena is almost echoes. It may have been his favorite president was Theodore Roosevelt. He loved Winston Churchill, obviously, too, Nixon. So I started writing the third wave, and I found out it began with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It would have been easier to say it began in the 1960s, but what happened was in World War II, we did some amazing things. When FDR said, Dr. New Deal is becoming Dr. Win the War. And one was the Manhattan Project. And we win the war in Japan, a war in the Pacific that Nixon fought, in the armed services for, in the Navy. But the big deal with Hiroshima and Nagasaki was beyond winning the war, it was earth-changing. We now have the capacity, we being humans, to blow up the world. And this was a time for celebration of the atomic bomb. From 45 to 49, the United States was the only nuclear monopoly in the world. That'll never happen again. We were it, the great superpower. But then Russia, as you all know, started developing its own nuclear weapons, and both the United States and Russia were forced to do a lot of nuclear testing. And in your exhibit here, I saw a bit about what happened in Nevada scene, bombing, testing, nuclear bombs, test, test, test. Out of that grew a fear of radiation sickness. Not in Nevada. People were happy there with the nuclear thing. For one thing, they were it seemed very pro-American. We wanted to show the American way, but we certainly didn't want to lose to Russia. If you went to Las Vegas, in Reno or something, and say circa 1950, you'd hear people just cheering the atomic test and later people doing nuclear dances and the atomic cocktails, and it was good for business in the state. But there were a group of people that were questioning the impact of radiation and fallout on life, including human life. And that group started with one of the leaders in worrying about that was Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was born in Springdale, Pennsylvania, along the Allegheny River. It was deeply polluted by industrial factories, glue factories, but she saw the beauty of Western Pennsylvania. And as a girl, she started writing and caring about the natural wonders of the world. She not just collecting pine cones and bird nests, but she started studying flora and fauna. And she loved the Allegheny, but wanted to see it clean. She didn't travel. She was smart. She went to school at Chapman University Chatham University, outside of Pittsburgh. And it was a girls' school then. And she realized she had a double-edged passion. Science, biology, like Theodore Roosevelt, the natural world, but also writing. She was really good. She got her first essay published in St. Nicholas Magazine, and she could write about the natural world well. It's a potent combination. You see it survive and sometimes in like National Geographic, where somebody can write about a place in the world with a scientific natural world integrity, but also lively jumping prose. And she ended up deciding to get a fellowship to Woods Hole. Woods Hole in the day is what Scripps is here at University of California. Woods Hole is in Cape Cod, just down the road from Hyannisport, the Kennedy compound. And at Woods Hole, if you were a young woman like Rachel Carson, you wanted to study oceans, that's where you went. They had an incredible library. And she went there and fell in love with the sea. And she wrote a beautiful series of essays in her life about the oceans. In fact, her early essays, she wrote on things like migratory eels, or things like, sea urchins, and the shad stocks. And in World War II, beyond writing a book about the seas, she worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And one of the things that our government created was Pawtuxet, Maryland. It's still there. It's called a Wildlife Research Center. But what they do at Pawtuxet then and now is test chemicals, new product to see how it's going to affect fish, birds, mammals, and potentially humans. This is what we do to make sure we stay safe and we don't live with hazards or introduce things that are toxic to the environment in ways that are unsustainable. And while at studying at Pawtuxet during World War II, Rachel Carson started worrying about DDT, pesticide, another miracle of World War II. DDT was the big game-changing, it's like Aladdin's lamp, presto. DDT, if you were Richard Nixon or Lyndon Johnson or John F. Kennedy going to the Pacific, you'd get sprayed and hosed down with DDT. In a good way. It killed lice, killed ticks, killed mosquitoes. It was a major factor in winning the island hopping campaigns in the Pacific. But it was another thing like nuclear bombs that got rushed through and not really regulated. After World War II, DDT was the miracle in agriculture. All over, people would take prop planes, whether it was U.S. Department of Agriculture or counties or states, and you just spray it. And kills the insects. It was loved by the big agriculture, just to put it in a two-word phrase. But Carson and the people at Pawtuxet were saying, wow, this is not doing well with fish, and it's thinning the eggs of birds, particularly the bald eagle and other raptors. And so this body of science research was being hatched really out of Pawtuxet. She tried to write an article about the perils of DDT for Reader's Digest. And they said no. You're taking on big agriculture, your science isn't so sure, and we're not ready for it. She gave it up, Rachel Carson, and continued writing brilliantly about the oceans. Rachel Carson, if I'm lucky, my book here hits the bestseller list for a couple weeks. Rachel Carson would be on her 3 sea books 80 weeks in a row, 120 weeks. I mean, she was a massive writer and really the progenitor of Jacques Cousteau. And after World War II, our country got really interested in undersea exploration. Not just space, which we all talk about, but we were really wondering about our oceans. And she wrote books. If you haven't read a Rachel Carson on the ocean, it doesn't matter if you're conservative, liberal, doesn't matter. When she writes about oceans, it's just pure, beautiful writing. But she was haunted by the DDT problem and nuclear fallout from Nevada and the Marshall Islands. Cut to the late 1950s. A woman named Marjorie Spock, whose brother was Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor. Marjorie Spock was an organic farmer in Long Island, out in Suffolk County, big agricultural spread, but said, I'm an organic grower. No pesticides. Her business, it's America. Problem. The county, Suffolk County, and USDA are spraying DDT blanket, and it would all go on her property. And she said, you're denying my ability to be an organic farmer. If any of you have an inclination for law, that's pretty interesting. Who owns the air above your property, and where is the demarcation line? And, what is a downwind, whether it's atomic fallout or DDT? What if it blows out? And incidentally, LA here is dying in smog in the late 1950s. There's no federal laws. Each state, city would create their own air quality. So, what good does it do for Pennsylvania to have a clean air policy, if New York doesn't and it blows over? And these are things that were concerning her, Marjorie Spock and Rachel Carson. So Spock sues in the American tradition, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and she loses. But in her loss, William O. Douglas, Supreme Court Justice, wrote a dissent backing Marjorie Spock in questioning the ethics of DDT being greenlit without proper regulatory procedures. And he was a big name, Supreme Court Justice, writing an article, it became a thing. Rachel Carson inherited not just the Pawtuxet documentation about DDT, but she inherited all of the briefs and legal investigatory documents from the Supreme Court case. In the late 50s, she started writing a book called Silent Spring. She came out in 1962. She's writing it in 59 and 61 while she is dying of cancer. Rachel Carson had breast cancer and metastasized. She lost all of her hair. She's going through deep radiation treatments, and her last goal was to write this one book exposing the dangers of DDT. And lo and behold, she finishes it in January 62. Now, we know what happened in the 60 election, the nail biter between Nixon and Kennedy. Kennedy comes in. He appoints Stuart Udall as Secretary of Interior, and he is, he made his move to do seashore preservation, because Kennedy and Nixon love the oceans. We all do. But Kennedy did something much harder than he got credit for. He pushed through Cape Cod National Seashore, Point Reyes by San Francisco, and Padre Island as Texas as big parks. Why those three are hard? It's seaside real estate. You understand that in California. It's one thing to save part of the Brooks Range of Alaska as a park with rock. You want to try saving a big swath of open coastline? It's tough. Kennedy got that done. He loved Rachel Carson's sea books. Now in January 62, she's coming out. I'm done with this book, Silent Spring. The New Yorker excerpted it, and holy hell broke it loose. Because Carson was making an attack on the chemical manufacturing of America. Because her gut argument was in the US, this is pre-EPA, where nobody's regulating this stuff. We're just ginning things out. There's no federal laws for stuff. And she wasn't calling for the banning of DDT. She was calling for much more deep federal investigation into it. Kennedy at a podium comes up and is asked about it and says, we're looking into Ms. Carson's research. The book was all over, front page of newspapers coming out, Rachel Carson. And he said, we're going to put it together, a Presidential Science Advisory Commission. He did, top people, MIT types, and they found Rachel Carson was correct. That DDT was detrimental to human health, was devastating the bald eagle towards near extinction, devastating falcon, etc. And that's a revolutionary book. There's sometimes a book comes out in presidential history that matters. Theodore Roosevelt, when he read The Jungle about sanitation, and factories, is one that always leaps to my mind like it. But overnight, Rachel Carson was telling you and you and you something different. She was saying that your children could get sick playing in the backyard. That the DDT menace, you didn't have to be a cult environmentalist, as they call it today, or a conservationist. You didn't have to be like David Brower in the Sierra Club climbing Yosemite, and doing 100-mile hikes. You'd just be an everyday worker, but your children in a backyard playground might be getting sick from the contamination of these chemicals being sprayed. That linked public health to Theodore Roosevelt conservation. And things never have been the same since. Rachel Carson died in 1964. She did Eric Severide for an hour on TV. Her research held up. She did Senate testifying. Kennedy, of course, is dead in Dallas in November '63. But in their wake, it started this tidal movement of the American people demanding clean air, clean water, and environmental regulations. It was a people's-generated movement. And Lyndon Johnson heard it. After Kennedy died, he pushed us through the first Clean Air Act of December 1963. And in another tangent, and an old salute to Theodore Roosevelt, Johnson signs the Wilderness Act of 1965. That was a big movement too. Wilderness Act of 1964 of Lyndon Johnson's said that we can have roadless wilderness, hunks of frontier, pristine wilderness with no roads. Because roads bring in the lumber trucks, roads bring in civilization, and that we can save parts of the American landscape. Lyndon continues in pushing through, as you know, if you go to the Presidential Library in Austin, they have a great wall of signing pens. Nixon has an awful lot of signing pens, too, of new things. Lyndon Johnson, for example, while Vietnam War is going on, does, in this state, Redwoods National Park with his wife, Lady Bird, who was a real conservation-driven first lady. But they did Redwood National Park in California, North Cascades. Johnson created the Pacific Coast Trail and the Appalachian Trail, created a national trail system. Lyndon and Lady Bird fought for and got anti-billboard laws for stretches of roads around the country under the term beautification. Lady Bird would go walk the Anacostia River by Washington and pick up garbage and put it into garbage bags. And, as a symbol, we've got to clean our rivers, clean our lakes. They did the wild and scene, it used to be LBJ grew up wanting dams. Federal dams was the FDR tradition, right? The Grand Coulee Dam or Tennessee Valley Authority. Lyndon, in Texas, that's what he did. And suddenly in '67, he's anti-dam because the public said we don't want dams in the Colorado River to ruin the Grand Canyon. We don't want dams here, there. There became a backlash. It was all growing. Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965, talking about auto industry safety, but also was going into the problem with lead in gasoline, that we can get the lead out and have unleaded gas like we have today. Oregon started worrying in the 60s about leading the way to do bottle returns and recycling. was a very big leader on a lot of these things. And it's bipartisan, guys. By the time Nixon becomes president in 1969, conservation is environmentalism is a bipartisan endeavor. John Salyer, a Republican from Pennsylvania, was the leading conservationist, not a Democrat. So I can't tell you enough of how bipartisan it was. Example, you go here and you see the Endangered Species Act displays gallery, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Do you know when that passed 50 years ago in 1973? Guess what the vote was in the Senate for the Endangered Species Act? 92-0. There was no senator against the Endangered Species Act. I'm just picking that as one example to tell you when I'm telling you a bipartisan fervor for this issue, and for good reason. One problem, I'll cut to Nixon. When Nixon gets elected, nobody thought of him as an environmentalist. He didn't really have a record on it, except he was from California. He understood the politics of conservation. He loved Theodore Roosevelt. He loved national parks. In my book, I show a picture of Nixon at the Grand Canyon, picture of, Nixon who got to go to Yellowstone. These are life-transforming trips for Nixon as a boy. He always loved the national park system, Nixon. But it wasn't his political bag, as you know. He's a foreign policy guy at heart. And other issues, but not, he wasn't making his name out of conservation like Senator Frank Church of Idaho, certainly. Or writing books called My Wilderness, like William O. Douglas was doing from the Supreme Court. But Nixon's president days, and the Santa Barbara oil spill happens. Now, first thing you need to know about January 69 and the Santa Barbara oil spill is that color television news, it went color in 1967. So by 69 January, that early, color TV was coming in our living rooms, shortly as the Vietnam War, and it was showing beautiful blue Santa Barbara, beautiful paradise Santa Barbara, with oil goo everywhere and birds encrusted in oil unable to take flight. And it looked horrible from a helicopter, and it looked worse on the ground. And Nixon's first instinct, which you can't blame him, is don't blame me. I've been president 8 days. I do not blame the Santa Barbara oil spill on my administration. Johnson's people didn't do the leasing and things properly. And Nixon's convinced by Walter Hickel, as Interior Secretary from Alaska, only in Interior days. Nixon comes out to Santa Barbara, goes on the beach, talks about it, talks to things, and does a pretty good job of what I would call containing the crisis by omitting the devastation. As Walter Hickel, as Interior Secretary, warned him, don't minimize. I'm on the ground here, don't minimize. Don't go to the mic and say, well, we'll clean it up. It is pretty bad disaster here. Nixon saw it with his own eyes, but he was leaning on the environment in 69, Nixon, on his friend John Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman, whoever remembers Ehrlichman today knows him for Watergate. And, but Ehrlichman, beyond going to UCLA, law and all this stuff, was the best Seattle-based water and land lawyer. Essentially what Ehrlichman made his living, and Nixon encounters Ehrlichman in the early 60s. He takes Nixon on a boat ride around Lake Washington, Puget Sound. Ehrlichman's a Republican, and you would call him today an environmental lawyer of a certain kind. He was basically what I would call a NIMBY lawyer, not in my backyard. Meaning wealthy people with homes around Puget Sound would hire Ehrlichman to say, you're not building an aluminum plant here. Our home values will depreciate. We didn't move to this neighborhood to be commercialized or industrialized, et cetera. We all know that in California. I mean, you just go to La Jolla and they're trying to keep all that out, right? I mean, that's what he was. Not real well known, but no, liked and admired in Seattle, Ehrlichman. And in 68, when Nixon ran for president, the press was asking him environmental questions, and Nixon's like, I don't have the answers to all these. Who do I know? Who's an environmental Republican? Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman not only won the job of his environmental advisor, but he became the domestic advisor for Nixon. The Sierra Club, which is a more liberal than moderate, although Sierra Club calls leaders later will call Ehrlichman a covert green in the Nixon White House. And Nixon tells Ehrlichman, look, you get in the weeds with all this environmental stuff. I just don't want to be demonized, and I don't want Ed Muskie to get credit for anything. Nixon, early as 69, Muskie was marketing himself as a politician as Mr. Clean Air, Mr. Clean Water, Ed Muskie of Maine. And Nixon was convinced that Muskie was going to be the person that ran the Democratic Party in 72 and he'd have to run against. And Nixon loathed Muskie for one huge reason. Muskie would regularly, almost daily, come to a microphone and denounce Nixon for everything. Nixon, he'd blame Santa Barbara for Nixon. He'd blame everything in Vietnam for Nixon. If you died in Vietnam, it's Nixon's fault. It's politics. But other Democrats, Nixon didn't loathe quite as much, but Muskie got under his skin. And so Ehrlichman knew, do not bring Muskie into any talks on the environment. By the summer of 69, Nixon has the Cuyahoga River catching fire in Ohio. Now, the Cuyahoga caught fire many times before, but here was Time magazine, Cuyahoga River. Nixon's ready to bask in the glory of two things that he found, one, a sad moment, but was politically beneficial to him, Ted Kennedy Chappaquiddick, and another, Neil Armstrong on the moon while Nixon's president. In Time is putting Cuyahoga River on fire and making it look like my administration's running dirty rivers. Now, the Cuyahoga is a sad story in Cleveland. You take a match and drop it, like propane, but there were other rivers on fire, the Rouge River and others in Rouge in Detroit. But Nixon now recognizing, wow, this stuff's getting really heavy. And then the reports, guys, coming out in the summer of 69, Lake Erie it's either dead or dying. Lake Erie was the great fishery of America. Out of all the Great Lakes, that's where the fish are because of its altitude, of its depth and the number of species. There was a fishing parrot dying. Kurt Vonnegut, the novelist, said Lake Erie is dying of human excrement and Clorox bottles. And the people were angry up there. Rivers on fire. Lake Erie, Ohio's a key political state. Nixon's paying attention. In the fall of 69, a Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, a Democrat, comes to Seattle and pops the idea, let's have a teach-in on the environment, Earth Day. And just like their teach-ins about Vietnam and protesting the war, we will demand a clean planet for tomorrow. And Gaylord gets it funded, Earth Day 1970, the first Earth Day, funded by Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, a very liberal, progressive labor leader who was backing people like Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King. And, Reuther was quite a figure in his day. In Nixon's political instincts, which are always there, is they're trying to sell me downriver on the environment. I'm going to out-environment the Democrats. Triangulation, Nixon, or Clinton did some of this kind of stuff. You want welfare reform, Republicans? How about this? Now I own this issue, right? And Nixon on January 1, 1970, at his home in San Clemente, California, before the big football game started, shocked the press by announcing NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which Scoop Jackson, Democratic senator from Washington, and John Dingell, Democrat from Michigan, worked with Ehrlichman And they got the document done, and Nixon signs it there. NEPA changed all your lives, because NEPA was making people have, whether you like it or not, NEPA has, you have to have an environmental impact statement. You're going to go build a new thing. What's your environmental impact statement? By nature, NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, gives birth to environmental law. You can't go somewhere and not find an environmental law program now in America. This is like the birth of it. And Nixon then doubles down on it and gives that, and you'll find it everywhere in quotes, the most far-reaching environmental State of the Union in American history in January 1970. It says it's the issue of the decade of the 1970s is making our planet, getting our lakes clean, our rivers clean, American heritage, very out there on it. And then Earth Day comes. And Nixon's feeling good. I've co-opted it, but he's suspicious of Earth Day because of Ruther and Nelson. And incidentally, before I mention Earth Day, the reason NEPA gets done, Nixon liked the Democratic Senator Scoop Jackson, and so did Ehrlichman, because Scoop, working with Boeing and others, did not go to the mics denouncing foreign policy in Vietnam. I can give you the list of Democrats beating up on Nixon in 1970 over Vietnam: Ted Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, Gaylord Nelson, Frank Church. I mean, you just laundry list them, not Scoop. So Nixon really treated, it's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the way Scoop Jackson, a Democrat, gets treated by Nixon and Muskie gets treated. John Connally of Texas and Scoop Jackson are two Democrats Nixon feels he can do business with and likes them personally. And he likes their families and, this kind of thing. But Earth Day, Nixon's like, what do I do? I'm set up to be a stooge. Millions of people saying I'm not doing enough on the environment, denouncing me. But he was worried Earth Day, on one hand, was a communist, pinko socialist plot. On the other hand, he was proud of his environmental record and thought the press wasn't giving him enough credit, which was true. So he decided to plant a tree in the White House with Pat Nixon to be photoed on Earth Day, being participatory. He allowed his Secretary of Interior, Walter Hickel, to go canoeing down a river in Alaska and celebrate Earth Day. He gave all the employees of the Interior Department the day off to go be part of the teach-in. And he had the FBI do surveillance on the Earth Day. And, historians like myself, we read other people's mail for a living. And one of the funnier letters I've ever encountered was, there used to be an environmental Republican named Pete McCloskey out of California. Some of you might remember. McCloskey was friends with Ehrlichman, and Ehrlichman was dying in a letter and telling him, the boss, Nixon, is wanting us to look into what's behind this Earth Day thing. And we've got now all the surveillance reports coming in from Earth Day. And it's like there are a lot of girls without bras and their dogs running and people are playing Frisbee and there's a little pot under, but we can't find some big subversion going on here. And so Nixon felt good about that. Earth Day kind of went. He didn't get beat up on Earth Day, Nixon. But the summer, and so much so, by the summer of 1970, Nixon takes the bold act of doing what Kennedy, I would argue, FDR almost pulled it off, but what certainly, and FDR did a lot. But let's just say what Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson couldn't do, streamlining all of these environmental things in government and creating the EPA. And EPA is born in the Nixon White House in the summer of 1970 at the exact time NOAA was created by Nixon for National Ocean, atmospheric research, both born in the summer of 70 by Richard Nixon. Nixon puts as the first head of the EPA, William Ruckelshaus. Ruckelshaus, Republican from Indiana, was the perfect choice because what EPA had to do is bust people. Meaning once NEPA goes through, if you follow me, guys, once you have to have environmental impact statements, are people complying is the issue? Companies. When Brown versus Topeka was passed for the Supreme Court, right, no more separate but equal, the civil rights movement wasn't about Brown. That got done. Earl Warren and all that. It was, are you implementing Brown? That's what Little Rock was in 57, or France Elementary School in New Orleans, 1960, with Ruby Bridges. Implementation. Ruckelshaus, working for Nixon, first head of the EPA, has to make sure companies, extraction industries, oil companies, chemical companies, sewage treatment, municipalities, are they complying? And Ruckelshaus was a tough cop because Ruckelshaus knew he had to make examples. So you didn't want to be on Ruckelshaus's dirty list because he was trying to show the Nixon administration means it. This wasn't political theater, NEPA and EPA. We're doing it. And he particularly aimed at things like the city of Atlanta that was dumping raw sewage into its things. I got the honor to, before Ruckelshaus died, to do his official oral history for Washington State and the University of Washington. And one time at a meal, he said, the problem, Doug, with you historians is when you write about nature and conservation, you always want to write about John Muir and who's Yosemite and the bears at Yellowstone, and you want to write about your own hiking adventures, but the truth of the matter was the revolution of the 60s and the Nixon years was sewage treatment. And we did not have sewage treatment plants. And Ray Ruckelshaus told me, problem is people don't want to go to Yale and get a PhD that I'm a sewage scholar. You're not getting, people want to write about other things. They just don't want to be their whole life. Their name is next to the word sewage. And he said, but that was what we did in the Nixon years that was gigantic to starting to force people in cities to have proper sewage treatment. And Nixon himself went to a new sewage treatment plant in Chicago, which they now had cleaned the really bad water in what was going on there. And to prove it, they had at his press conference a glass of water, and he was told to drink it. It's safe now. Here, Mr. President. He's like, no, I prefer not, and wouldn't drink it. And on the air ride out of Chicago, he said, he goes, Johnson, Lady Bird, can be known for redwood trees. And I'm going to be known as the sewage president. And it's the media's not, and they don't realize how much harder it is to do sewage treatment than to save a strand of redwood trees. Not that saving a strand of redwood trees doesn't have its complications. But at any rate, by December 70, right, when EPA's opened its doors, we do the first, Nixon does the Clean Air Act of 1970, which we're still living on, our clean air standards. And Nixon now starts rolling with the environment. Did he believe in all this? I mean, he's now, I mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, FDR, now you're getting Nixon in this category of really important environmental precedents of the very top order. I got a helpful letter from Tricia Nixon because I saw her husband, Ed Cox, at an event at Federal Hall in New York. We got to talking, and he said historians will never give President Nixon quite the fair chance on the environment because they don't like him, and they're not going to give him credit for all that. And I said, yeah, but, I flipped it a little bit, and I said, the thing is, Kennedy, you see at Hyannisport, Blue Mine, the Atlantic, Cape Cod, John F. Kennedy, Johnson at the ranch, Pedernales River in Texas. Nixon is always in a suit, standing on a beach. And visually, you don't connect environment with Nixon. And yet, I said, so if you can, and they said, oh, you don't understand. And I said, she wrote me a really nice and important letter explaining some of why Nixon had a great affinity for the natural world, including sequoia redwoods gifted to China in exchange for the panda bears. It's Nixon on his own initiative that wants military bases to become wildlife refuges. It's Nixon who saves the Everglades from being the massive jet port, which was deeply controversial and not popular with Republicans, that he sided with the environmentalists. It's Nixon who creates the Golden Gate National Recreation Area and synced with the Sierra Club. It's Nixon who does Gateway National Recreation in New York, New Jersey. It's Nixon who saves places like Cumberland Island. But the optics, when he tried to get credit for events, he went to the Grand Tetons once. And, again, he's never wearing the proper clothes out in these outdoor environments. And he had, and a big figure in my book's Lawrence Rockefeller, who was a great advisor in environment, not just Ehrlichman to Nixon. But by 72, Nixon's record in the environment is quite significant when he's running for re-election. In fact, the National Park Service was created by Ulysses S. Grant in 1872, Yellowstone. 1972, Nixon saves the Buffalo River in Arkansas as a national wild river that can never be dammed or industrialized. It was a bitter dispute in Arkansas. When William O. Douglas went to save the Buffalo River, people would put barbed wire across the river. There are people that shot at green protesters. It was really Democrat William J. Fulbright hobby horsing it. And Nixon's aligning himself with those guys on parks and the environment. And Nixon does the big agreements with Canada and the United States on clean air, and which was a prototype of international environment. But in 72, William Ruckelshaus went to Stockholm at the big United Nations meeting on the environment. Massive importance, I don't have time to get into. But he comes up, Ruckelshaus, to speak, feeling good. We created the EPA, Clean Air Act. We're doing agreements with Canada, leading the way to show how countries can work together. We're doing species survival. We're doing ocean work and ocean studies. And they wouldn't they got booed and hissed. They wouldn't let Ruckelshaus talk because of the Vietnam War in the UN. And you know who came out of the audience and told everybody to shut up? Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, and said, let him speak. They're leading the way, the Nixon administration, on a lot of these environmental things. And it's harder when you're working a Republican then. It was still, you had to straddle it. And Muskie went in for the kill in 72 on Nixon and the environment because there was a Clean Water Act going. And however many billions of dollars was put, Muskie'd say, we need more. Nixon would say, I'll give you this much more. It was a pyramid thing. It never was going to end. So Nixon didn't do it, but it passed. He vetoed it. But today that happened in the Nixon years, the Clean Water Act of 72. The last big one of the Nixon years is endangered species. And endangered species was Nixon's pal and a fascinating man, if you never heard of him, to read about, Russell Train. Russell Train was a founder of the World Wildlife Fund. Do you ever see on TV those panda photos? He was an expert on Africa. In front of his office always was orangutan, big orangutan painting Russell Train would have. And Russell Train was the Theodore Roosevelt mammal, save all species guy, Noah's Ark mentality guy in the Nixon White House. But it's Nixon that gave him the leash to do all of that. And Train gets working with others, I write about in the book, to get the drafting out of the White House an Endangered Species Act, working with Congress, working with the Senate, and as I said, by December 73, it's passed. It saves the alligator. It saves bald eagles. It saves, the California condor. The list of species is large, and you can deal with it in the book. But something else got done by Nixon in this period. Nixon banned DDT. Rachel Carson's War on DDT, she died, but a book came out in 62, it's Nixon in 72, that bans DDT because Ruckelshaus. Nixon wasn't happy about it. He got a lot of flack from the chemical people, a lot. You want to read angry missives. The Nixon administration was banning chemical and over-regulating pesticides. It cost Nixon a lot of political capital to do that. He knew it. He was bitter about it because he knew he had to do it because the science was there, but it wasn't good politics in his mind. But why does my book end in 1973? Well, because the Endangered Species Act. And I hope to come back in December here to the library for endangered species. But by late 73, Watergate. And late 73 is the Arab oil embargo, OPEC and all of that. And suddenly there was anger that the environmental movement had literally run out of gas. And the counter-revolution was on energy independence. And that America can't be held hostage by these Arab countries. It was because of Nixon's backing of Israel. Don't have time to get into all of that. But nevertheless, at that point, Nixon doesn't have a political home. The Barry Goldwater conservatives did not like the EPA Clean Air, Clean Water Act. The hard right did not like Nixon's dabbling with the Greens, if you like. The Democrats, minus Scoob Jackson, never gave Nixon credit for anything. And even David Brower, the most extreme, activist, environmentalist of the era, later would say, we weren't fair to Nixon. We never gave him the credit he deserved to continue doing this. But liberals were going to trash Nixon on it. The oil, gas, extraction, chemical manufacturing companies are being regulated aren't happy with Nixon. Man without a home. And of course, by the end of Watergate, and he comes back, and it's another exciting story of his resurrection post-Watergate. But his environmental legacy was cemented by the time he left. So when we have to look at the presidents that mattered in our country's environmental history, in any real sense, you've got Theodore Roosevelt and FDR, you've got Kennedy and Johnson combined with Udall, and you have Richard Nixon, Ehrlichman, Train, Ruckelshaus. That's who did it. But in the one that matters today, the one that we're living off of, is NEPA, EPA, Clean Air, Clean Water, Endangered Species, cornerstone of Nixon's legacy. So I hope in my book that I gave Nixon, and most of my talks since my book comes out are not Nixon focused, part of my story. But today I thought I'd tilt it a little bit in his direction, being at this wonderful presidential library. Thank you all very much, and I'd love to take some questions.
Thank you so much. Let's get a round of applause for Mr. Brinkley. We're going to open the floor for a couple questions here. For anyone that has questions, just raise your hand and I'll come get to you. First question right over here.
Thank you for being here. Yeah, I'm a graduate of UC Santa Barbara, and I think they're still cleaning up that oil spill.
Yes.
Like 30 years ago.
There was a group called GOO, Get the Oil Out.
Well, they're drilling off the coast too, so that's contributing. But I'm just wondering, with the president's foreign policy expertise, did he ever approach China at the time about their contribution to polluting our planet?
Great question. And I have not seen evidence of that. I think they were just trying to have a new relationship, with the exception of, the panda bears meant a lot to Nixon. And I'll tell you guys a funny, and I edited the Nixon tapes. And just to break up with Luke Nichter, we did these, all the Nixon tapes, you just don't want heavy. So for a lighter one, and we ran negative bits of Nixon too, don't get me wrong, every year or something, but on a lighter front, Nixon was calling the National Zoo, checking on those pandas all the time, and was reading up on the mating habits of them, and was talking to the zoo of how can they breed them into captivity. And Nixon saw it's not artificial that Nixon loved the redwood trees and the sequoias of California in a very real and visceral way. Nixon's home on San Clemente spoke to itself. You go to that property, he was in love with the ocean. Nixon got interested in whales. People won't believe that Nixon became very interested because we were discovering whale songs and all of this, and we always think of the darker side of Nixon. He became and created the Marine Mammal Protection Act to protect the whales of the world. And that wasn't somebody else importing it to Nixon. He was part of all of that process. But with China, I don't think so. I don't think that they got into environmental dialogue. To be honest, it wasn't really global yet. That Stockholm conference in '72 is credited with starting this big global conversation, and that was the year that he went to China. All I would say is that China dominated '72, which it should have, that big breakthrough. Environment was the secondary story to Nixon's China gambit and détente with Russia, but it got a lot of press, the environment, and Nixon didn't get quite the credit he deserved because of his enemies list, people that were out for him.
Thanks. We have one last question right over here.
You mentioned that Kennedy gets credit for saving so much beachfront property, but Nixon, with his turning the military bases into environmental, saved his neighbor.
Absolutely.
There's a lot more beachfront property there in Camp Pendleton.
Yeah, absolutely. And with Camp Pendleton, and it was, he went driving around with B.B. Rebozo, in not just San Clemente, but in Dana Point, Laguna area. And Nixon started seeing those cookie cutter housing and was recognizing the development and was very much about keeping Camp Pendleton as open space. When you drive down there, it shocks visitors. You guys live here, you're used to it. But suddenly, like, my God, it's this open beach. And so, no, I honestly, I'm not, the Nixon administration did a lot on every issue. I'm not even getting into individual park efforts and legacy for the parks initiatives that they did. It was a big part and parcel of the administration.
All right, let's get a round of applause for Mr. Brinkley. You can go ahead and purchase his book just right around the corner. He will be personalizing books right through this hall right over here. And drive safe.